By the time she died, an entire empire wept. Suleiman, one of the most powerful rulers in human history, sat alone in his palace, devastated. He had conquered cities, he had broken armies, he had expanded an empire across 3 continents. But he could not bring her back. Almost 4 decades earlier, this same woman had arrived in Constantinople in chains. She had no protection, no family within reach, no power over her own body, her own future, or even her own name. To the men who bought and sold her, she was cargo, a transaction. And yet, this girl would do something almost impossible. She would enter the imperial harem as an enslaved concubine and rise until the rules of the empire itself had to bend around her. She would break 200 years of Ottoman tradition. She would become the legal wife of Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. This is the story of Hurrem Sultan. To understand her rise, you have to begin with 2 worlds. The one she was taken from and the one she was forced into. She was probably born in the early 1500s in or near the town of Rohatyn. Today, Rohatyn is in western Ukraine. In her time, it belonged to the Kingdom of Poland, in a borderland region called Ruthenia. Her birth name is uncertain. Some sources call her Alexandra Lisowska, others say Anastasia. Later accounts suggest her father may have been an Orthodox priest. The truth is, her early life exists mostly in fragments: a place, a possible name, a religion, a family that would soon disappear from her life forever. What we know is this: she came from a vulnerable borderland. Crimean Tatar raiders, allied with the Ottoman world, moved through that region again and again. These were not rare accidents, they were systematic, organized. Entire villages could vanish overnight. Their populations marched south toward the Crimean Peninsula, toward the slave markets of the Black Sea. One of those markets was Kaffa. Kaffa was one of the largest slave trading centers in the known world. Through it passed men, women and children from across Eastern Europe. Ruthenians, Poles, Circassians, Russians, all funneled into the Ottoman Empire's appetite for labor, military service and the imperial harem. Sometime in the early 1520s, while she was still in her teens, the girl from Rohatyn was taken. The route south led through Crimea, then across the Black Sea toward Constantinople. That crossing was more than a journey between places. It was a crossing between lives. Behind her, a childhood, a language, a faith, a father. Ahead of her, the Ottoman capital. A city of 500,000 people. A world of mosques and minarets, grand bazaars and narrow streets. Of power so absolute it made European courts look modest. And at the centre of that world, one man. Suleiman had inherited the Ottoman throne in 1520 after the death of his father Selim the Grim. He was young, newly crowned, and already ruler of an empire stretching from Hungary to Persia, from the Black Sea to North Africa. Europe would later call him Suleiman the Magnificent. But when the girl from Rohatyn entered his world, he was still at the beginning of what would become a 46-year reign, one of the longest and most consequential in Ottoman history. She entered the imperial harem of Topkapi Palace, and there she was given a new name. Hurrem. In Persian, it means the joyful one. Most people imagine the Ottoman harem as something from a fantasy, a luxurious prison of beautiful women waiting for a sultan's attention. The reality was far more complex. and far more dangerous. The harem was a political institution. It housed not just concubines, but the Sultan's mother, his sisters, female relatives, servants, educators, and administrators. At its peak, it contained hundreds of women. It had its own hierarchy, its own economy, its own web of alliances and rivalries. To rise in that world, beauty was not enough. Beauty could open a door. It could not keep you alive inside the room. To survive required intelligence, patience, language, timing, the ability to understand what could be said, what had to remain silent, and which people mattered before anyone told you their names. And above all, an enslaved woman entering that world had to understand one rule: one concubine, one son. This system had a deliberate purpose. It prevented any single woman from gathering too much influence over the Sultan. It had governed Ottoman succession for generations. Hürrem would dismantle it entirely. By 1521, just a year after entering the harem, Suleiman had eyes for no one else. Contemporary accounts struggle to explain exactly why. Physical descriptions of Hürrem vary wildly. Some call her strikingly beautiful. Others describe her as pretty but unremarkable, petite with reddish hair, pale skin. But what every account agrees on is something harder to measure. She was electric. A presence that filled rooms, a laugh that was impossible to ignore. Venetian ambassadors, men who had seen the great courts of Europe and were not easily impressed, wrote home about her with a mixture of fascination and alarm. Then came the first tradition to fall. Hürrem bore Suleiman not one son, but 6 children. 5 of them were sons. The Ottoman custom that had governed harem succession for generations was simply set aside for her. This alone was extraordinary, unprecedented. When Suleiman went to war, which was often, Hürrem wrote to him. Long, passionate letters in Ottoman Turkish, a language she had learned from nothing. She described her longing like fire. She wrote of sleepless nights, of a heart that found no peace without him. She wrote like a woman who understood that in her world, being remembered was the same as being safe. Suleiman wrote back. He called her his Hürrem, his spring, his bright moon. And he composed formal Ottoman poetry for her. For a sultan to attach himself so openly, so publicly to a slave concubine was politically charged. It made her visible. And visibility, inside a court built on hierarchy and silence, could become a weapon. Then came the moment that stopped the empire cold. Sometime around 1533, Suleiman did something no Ottoman sultan had done in over 200 years. He freed Hürrem from slavery, and then he married her, not informally, not in some quiet private arrangement, a formal legal marriage, a nikah ceremony, conducted according to Islamic law, witnessed by court officials, recorded in imperial documents. The girl from Rohatyn, taken in a raid as a teenager, sold through the markets of Kaffa and Constantinople, entered into the harem as an enslaved concubine. She was now the legal wife of the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire. The reaction was immediate and visceral. Foreign ambassadors sent urgent letters home. Ottoman officials whispered that the Sultan had lost his reason. Traditionalists were horrified. Critics accused Hürrem of witchcraft, of manipulation, of poisoning the Sultan's mind. But those explanations say more about the people making them than about Hürrem herself. They could not understand her power, so they made it sound unnatural. A new title was created for her, one that had never existed before. Haseki Sultan, She had not simply climbed within the existing system, she had forced the system to create a new category for her. And here, at the threshold of everything that followed, the question that historians have debated for 5 centuries: was it love, or was it strategy? The honest answer is that it was both. Love could be real, love could also protect. Affection could become access, access could become influence. Influence could decide the future of children, rivals, fortunes, and lives. She had arrived with nothing. Through intelligence, adaptation, emotional force, and extraordinary timing, she had survived one of the most dangerous courts in the world. Then she rose inside it. She was Hurrem Sultan. She was free. She was the legal wife of the most powerful man alive. But she was not finished. Because the marriage was only the beginning. The next chapter of her story would leave the world of love and survival behind and move into something colder. The brutal politics of succession. Rival sons, powerful enemies, accusations that follow her name to this day. Did Hurrem merely survive the Ottoman court, or did she learn how to rule from inside it? She was no longer a slave, she was no longer a concubine, she was Hurrem Sultan, the legal wife of Suleiman the Magnificent. The girl from Rohatyn had broken a custom so old that most people at court treated it like law. But in the Ottoman palace, marriage did not mean safety. Power was never simply given. It was taken, defended, fought for, in silence. Hurrem had risen higher than anyone expected, but the higher she rose, the more dangerous her position became, because she was no longer only protecting herself. She was protecting her children. And in the Ottoman dynasty, sons were never only sons. They were heirs, they were rivals, they were possible sultans. And if one prince became sultan, the others could become corpses. This was the brutal logic beneath the beauty of the palace. The Ottoman Empire did not have a clean, automatic rule of succession. A prince had to survive. He had to gather support. He had to reach the throne before his brothers did. And Hurrem understood exactly what that meant. The first great figure standing in the path of that future was not Mustafa himself. It was Ibrahim Pasha. Ibrahim was one of the most extraordinary men of Suleiman's reign. He was born in Parga on the Greek coast into a Christian family, and like Hurrem, he entered the Ottoman world through captivity. But where Hurrem's path led into the harem, Ibrahim's led into Suleiman's personal service, and from there, into the center of imperial government. He was intelligent, gifted, ambitious, and he had one advantage above all others. He had known Suleiman since the Sultan's youth. Over time, their bond became one of the defining relationships of the early reign. Suleiman trusted him, promoted him, relied on him, and in 1523, only 3 years after coming to the throne, Suleiman made Ibrahim Grand Vizier, the highest office in the empire, beneath the Sultan himself. The speed of that rise shocked people. He had not climbed slowly through the old ranks. He had been lifted by favor, by talent, by intimacy. And for years, he seemed untouchable. For Hurrem, that made him dangerous. Not because we can prove they were locked in open conflict from the beginning, but because Ibrahim represented a kind of access to Suleiman that no one else possessed. He had history with the Sultan. He had office. He had military reputation. He had the confidence of the court. And he belonged to a political world in which Mustafa, Suleiman's eldest surviving son, seemed like the natural future. That made Mustafa powerful. It also made him fatal. In Ottoman succession, princes did not simply lose an election. They lost the world. If Mustafa took the throne, Hurrem's sons would stand between him and security, and that meant they would stand very close to death. So Hurrem's problem was not personal jealousy, it was survival. Her own survival, her son's survival, the survival of the entire future she had built. Then Ibrahim began to make mistakes. The problem with being raised too high, too fast, is that eventually people begin to ask where favour ends and sovereignty begins. Ibrahim's power had become enormous. During campaigns in the East, he acted with sweeping authority. His language began to sound dangerously close to the language of kingship. He used titles and gestures that alarmed people around him. In a world where only one man could truly be sultan, even the appearance of competing majesty was dangerous. And Suleiman noticed. Whether Hurrem encouraged those suspicions, we cannot prove. Later writers believed she did. Her enemies certainly believed she did. And it is easy to understand why. If Ibrahim fell, Hurrem's position became stronger. If Ibrahim fell, one of Mustafa's most important protectors disappeared. But history does not give us a signed confession, a secret letter, a witness. What we have is a pattern. Ibrahim grew too powerful. Suleiman grew uneasy. Hurrem benefited. On March 15th, 1536, Ibrahim Pasha dined at Topkapi Palace. He did not leave alive. That night, by Suleiman's order, the man who had been his closest companion, his Grand Vizier, and one of the most powerful officials in the empire, was executed. The man once called Makbul, the favoured one, became Maktul, the executed one. The fall of Ibrahim was not simply the death of one minister. It changed the balance of the court. It removed the one man whose intimacy with Suleiman could rival Hurrem's own. It weakened the political structure around Mustafa. And it showed everyone something terrifying. No one was untouchable, not even the Sultan's favourite. But with Ibrahim gone, the question of succession did not disappear. It only became sharper. Mustafa was still alive, still admired, still older than Hurrem's sons, still loved by soldiers, officials, poets, and many people who believed he had the qualities of a future ruler. One Austrian diplomat wrote about him with something close to admiration. He described Mustafa as marvelously educated, prudent, and of perfect age to rule. The empire expected him. And that was the problem. By 1553, Suleiman was no longer the young ruler who had come to the throne in 1520. He was older, more suspicious, more aware that power could move away from him while he was still alive. Hurrem's son-in-law, Hürrem Pasha, was now Grand Vizier. From the military world around the Persian campaign came reports that disturbed Suleiman deeply. The soldiers admired Mustafa. Some believed the aging sultan should give way to his son. There were stories of letters, stories of plots. Were those stories true? Were they exaggerated? Were they manufactured? This is where the record becomes dangerous, because the answer depends on which source you trust, and every source comes from a world already divided by fear. On October 6th, 1553, Mustafa came to his father's camp. He entered the imperial tent. Outside were soldiers who loved him. Inside was the closed world of dynastic power. The prince had come to meet his father, but the meeting was not a conversation. He was attacked by the Sultan's executioners. He struggled, but he was overpowered. Mustafa died without a throne, without a trial, without the chance to defend himself, before the empire that had expected him to rule. The shock was enormous. The soldiers were devastated. Anger spread through the army. Poets wrote elegies. People mourned Mustafa not only as a prince, but as a lost future. A man many believed had been destroyed by palace intrigue. And almost immediately, suspicion turned toward Hurrem. There was no document with her name on it, no confession, no order written in her hand, no surviving proof that she commanded Mustafa's death. But the logic of suspicion was powerful. Rustem was her son-in-law. Ibrahim, who might have balanced the court against her, was already dead. Mustafa's death benefited her sons. History cannot convict her, but it cannot entirely clear her either. That is what makes Hürrem so difficult to judge. She lived inside a system where motherhood and politics could not be separated. To protect a son was to enter the succession struggle. To enter the succession struggle was to accept that someone else's son might die. In that world, innocence was not always the same thing as harmlessness. Yet to reduce Hürrem only to rivalry, suspicion, and death would be another kind of distortion. Because while all of this was happening, she was also building, literally. In Istanbul, she commissioned the Haseki Sultan complex, one of the most important charitable foundations associated with an Ottoman royal woman. It included a mosque, a school, a soup kitchen, a hospital. This was not decoration. It was public power. A building could do what a palace whisper could not. It could make her visible. It could make her permanent. It could make her name part of the city itself. She also endowed a major charitable complex in Jerusalem. Her letters and gifts connected her to foreign courts, including the Polish court, where her correspondence with King Sigismund II shows a woman acting in the language of diplomacy, not merely domestic affection. This was not the normal role of an Ottoman consort, but Hürrem had never played a normal role. She did not sit on the imperial council. She did not hold a formal office. She did not command an army. But power does not always wear an official title. Sometimes power is access. Sometimes it is information. Sometimes it is the ability to keep the ruler's attention when others lose it. The ability to recommend, warn, persuade, delay, protect, and remove. By those measures, Hürrem had power. Not formal rule, but governance, in everything except name. By 1558, Hürrem was ill. The exact nature of her illness is not clear. Contemporary observers knew she had been suffering, but the record does not give us a clean diagnosis. On April 15, 1558, Hurrem Sultan died in Constantinople. She was probably in her early 50s. The night before she died, Suleiman reportedly swore to her, by the soul of his father Selim, that he would never approach another woman. He kept that promise. When news of her death spread through Constantinople, Suleiman broke the protocol that normally required him to remain isolated during family funerals. He came out of the palace. He walked in her procession. Coins were distributed. Food was given to the poor. Crowds filled the streets. She was not buried as a forgotten concubine. She was buried in a mausoleum beside the Suleimania complex, near the great mosque that would become the architectural symbol of Suleiman's reign. She was not placed there as a footnote. She was placed at the heart of imperial memory. She did not live to see her son Selim become sultan. She did not live to see the full age that later historians would call the Sultanate of Women. But that age began with her. After Suleiman's death, Ottoman royal women would become increasingly visible in politics. Mothers, wives, and favorites would influence appointments, diplomacy, construction, succession, and the management of the dynasty. Some would become more powerful than Hurrem in formal terms, but they followed a path she had opened. That was Hurrem's true revolution. Not simply that Suleiman loved her, not simply that he married her, not simply that her son eventually took the throne. Her revolution was that she turned intimacy into authority, motherhood into strategy, charity into public legitimacy, and survival into a new model of female power. She had been taken from a village in Ruthenia, sold through the markets of the Black Sea, given a new name in a language she did not yet speak, placed inside a palace built to control women like her. And somehow, from inside that controlled world, she learned how power moved. She became Hurrem Sultan. She became Suleiman's legal wife. She became the mother of princes. She became one of the most consequential women in Ottoman history. And she did it without ever sitting on a throne, leading an army, or holding a formal office of state. That is why Hurrem Sultan still unsettles history, because she forces us to ask where power really lives, in the law, in the army, in the council chamber, or in the private rooms where rulers listen, hesitate, remember, and decide. Hurrem began life as a captive. She ended it as a woman the empire could not ignore. That is the story of Hurrem Sultan,